We've explored Sauron's island of werewolves, and now it's time to venture inside the fortress of Morgoth. Maya Gavanen Melanin Amenix Wilaid. My name's Rainbow Dave, and welcome to the 7th video in our playlist untangling the great tale of Beren and Lúthien. And everything that I have talked about so far has been leading to this. Because in this video we will witness Beren and Lúthien come face to face with not only the Dark Lord Morgoth, but also the hallowed and blessed Silmarils. However, before I get back to them, I do want to take a little bit of time to talk about Angband and why this iron prison is such a dreadful place. And I'll start with the name, because the most common translation of Angband is that one that I've used plenty of times before, Iron Prison. But Tolkien does also give us a second translation, Hell of Iron. And the last time that we saw this subterranean stronghold was during the Battle of Sudden Flame, when Morgoth sent forth great rivers of flame that ran down swifter than balrogs from Thangorodrim and poured over all the plain, and the mountains of iron belched forth fires of many poisonous hues. And 11 years later, the scars of this sudden flame are still present upon the landscape. Tolkien gives us an incredibly evocative description of the land outside Angband at the time that Beren and Lúthien arrive there. And the first thing to talk about is the Desert of Gasping Dust that lies before the gates of Angband. Once upon a time, and by that I really only mean about a decade ago, Morgoth was besieged by the armies of the Noldor, and he was locked away inside his iron prison, and a grassy meadow grew all the way up to the very doors of Morgoth's stronghold. But in the opening gambit of the Dagor Bragolach, this meadow was scorched and desiccated and transformed into an Fauglith, the thirsty ash, or the gasping dust. So to even get close to Angband, Beren and Lúthien must first follow the drear and weary road of dust up to the impassable gate. But Tolkien also describes black chasms as of writhing serpents before the cliffs, and upon the embattled walls are carrion fowl crying with fell voices. Beneath them is the impregnable gate at the foot of the mountain, and above it reared 1,000 feet of precipice. However, as dreadful as the outside of Angband may be, it's nothing compared to what waits inside. And this seems like a perfect opportunity to introduce a brand new villain into the story, one of Morgoth's most terrifying servants and perhaps the most dangerous character in the entire tale of Beren and Lúthien. His name is Kacharoth the Red, although he is also known among the elves as Anfauglir, which means the jaws of thirst. And unlike his father Draugluin, or even Sauron himself, Kacharoth is the mightiest werewolf that would ever walk the world. And we're actually told that Kacharoth exists for a pretty singular purpose. Remember a few videos ago when I first talked about Huan, the Hound of Valinor, and I said that it was doomed that he would not die until he encountered the mightiest wolf ever to walk the world? Well, Morgoth was familiar with that prophecy too. And I think Morgoth was pretty afraid of Huan because he went to pretty extreme lengths to ensure that he possessed the ultimate Huan-slaying weapon. But what I find so fascinating about Kacharoth is that he was not born to be the greatest of his kind. Instead, he was made that way by Morgoth. We are told that when Kacharoth was born, he was just a whelp from among the race of Draugluin, but Morgoth fed him with his own hand and put his power upon him. And in time, Kacharoth grew so large that he could creep into no den, but lay huge and hungry before the feet of Morgoth. And just to make this even more abundantly creepy, we are told that what Morgoth fed to Kacharoth was living flesh. Now, I guess we can speculate a little bit here on the nature of this living flesh. On the one hand, Tolkien might just be talking about orc flesh, but we do know that Angband was a prison, and after the Dagor Bragolach, we know that the Dark Lord took many prisoners from among the elves. So could it be that Morgoth is using these elven prisoners as live food for his pet werewolf? Was Kacharoth raised on the flesh of captive elves? Well, we are actually given an answer to that question in Canto 12 of the Lay of Lúthien, and that answer is yes. Tolkien tells us that Kacharoth was fed in fairest flesh of elves and men. How distressing is that? Anyway, while we're on the topic of Kacharoth, we can now segue back to Beren and Lúthien, because Kacharoth is the first inhabitant of Angband to be made aware of them. And if you've seen the last video, then you will know that when Beren and Lúthien arrive before the gate of Angband, they do so in magical disguises. Lúthien is wearing the bat-fell form of the vampire Thuringwethil, and Beren is cloaked in the wolfheim of Draugluin, the first werewolf and the father of Kacharoth. And when Kacharoth espied them from afar, he was filled with doubt, because news has long since reached Angband that Draugluin is dead. He was killed by Huan months ago when Sauron was vanquished and ousted from Tol in Gauhoth, and so Kacharoth has plenty of reasons to be suspicious. When vampire Lúthien and werewolf Beren approach the gate of Angband, Kacharoth comes out to greet them, but he denies them entry and he draws near them with menace, scenting something strange in the air about them. And if Beren were alone, I think this could very well be the end of his quest. But he is not alone, and in this moment we are told that some power, descended from of old, from divine race, possessed Lúthien, and casting back her foul raiment she stood forth, small before the might of Kacharoth, but radiant and terrible. And what Lúthien does next is incredibly badass. We are told that she lifts her hand and she commands Kacharoth to sleep. Her exact words are, "Fall now into dark oblivion, and forget for a while the dreadful doom of life." And then Kacharoth was felled as though lightning had smitten him. How cool is that? And so Beren and Lúthien are now free to pass the gate and descend the labyrinthine stairs and enter the stronghold of their enemy, which Tolkien describes as the greatest deed that has been dared by elves or men. Eventually, they descend all the way into the nethermost hall, which we are told was upheld by horror, lit by fire, and filled with weapons of death and torment. And right in the center of this nethermost hall is the throne of Morgoth, where he sits with his iron crown upon his head, and all three Silmarils set into it. Now, as Beren and Lúthien approach the throne, they are back in their werewolf and vampire disguises. But as soon as Morgoth looks upon Lúthien, her disguise is stripped by his will, and he bent his gaze upon her. However, what I find very interesting is that Morgoth's will does not strip the disguise of Beren. And we know this can't be because Beren possesses a power that Lúthien doesn't, he is just a mortal, but I think therein lies his advantage. This is another example of that arrogance that both Morgoth and Sauron share. They just can't believe that a mortal man could ever be a threat, or could ever even have what it takes to enter Angband. During the Dagor Bragolach chapter, we are told that Morgoth esteemed too lightly the valour of the elves, and of men he took yet no account. If he had, the Noldor would have perished utterly. But men just aren't on Morgoth's radar. Although, believe me, after this, they will be. Anyway, when Morgoth gazed upon Lúthien, we are told that she was not daunted by his eyes, and she named her own name, and offered her service to sing before him. And as Morgoth looks upon Lúthien, he is beguiled by his own malice. Tolkien states that he conceived in his thought an evil lust and a design more dark than any that had yet come into his heart since he fled from Valinor. And this is not the first time that Morgoth has felt lust. In part 10 of the History of Middle-earth, Morgoth's Ring, we are given a few details that don't make it into the Silmarillion, but they do illuminate just how horrendous Morgoth really is. And I should point out that this was an earlier draft, so do take it with a pinch of salt, but in an essay called Myths Transformed, Tolkien wrote about the creation of the sun and the moon, and the Maiar spirit of fire who was tasked with guiding the sun, Arien. Now, in this essay, we are told that Melkor lusted after all light, desiring it jealously for his own. And he even goes to Arien, afire at once with desire and anger, and he says to her, "I have chosen thee, and thou shalt be my spouse, and together we shall wield all splendour and mastery. Then the kingship of Arida shall be mine, and thou shalt be my partner in glory." Now, to this, Arien is basically like, absolutely not. But then Melkor ravished her, and he was burned, and his brightness darkened, and light pained him exceedingly, and he hated it. And this ravishing of Arien is incredibly dark, and there's probably a good reason that it wasn't included in the Silmarillion, but I bring it up just to point out that Morgoth does have a history of lusting after exceedingly powerful, light-based Maiar women. And there is one more woman to talk about before I move on, because way back, before even the Song of Creation, Varda, that's the Queen of the Valar, the sort of goddess of light, whom the elves call Elbereth Githorniel, knew Melkor and rejected him, and he hated her and feared her more than all others whom Eru made. So, of the three women that Melkor has entangled himself with, Varda frightened him more than all others in creation, Arien burned and blackened him, and Lúthien is also going to screw him over in a wonderfully epic way. Actually, while we're talking about this, there is of course a fourth female character that Morgoth tries to partner with, and that's Negoliant. Now, unlike Varda and Arien and Lúthien, Negoliant is terrible, but don't forget, she too messes up Morgoth in a very major way, and it's pretty impossible to feel bad for him. Anyway, back to Lúthien in Angband. While Morgoth is watching her and taking secret pleasure in his thought, Lúthien suddenly disappears from his sight. But out of the shadows comes a song of such surpassing loveliness and of such blinding power that Morgoth is forced to sit there and listen to it. Now, we have seen Lúthien's sleep-inducing magic a few times already in the story. She, of course, escaped Doriath by putting her father's guards to sleep. She struck down Kacharoth only a moment ago, and she even made Sauron sleepy back in Tol in Gawahoth. But this is the ultimate test of her power. We are told that Morgoth's court were cast down in slumber, and all the fires faded and were quenched, but the Silmarils in the crown on Morgoth's head blazed forth suddenly with a radiance of white flame. Morgoth fights her spell, but his head gets heavier and heavier. And so I'll have to read Tolkien's exact words describing this moment, because once again, the language that he uses conjures such a marvellously mythical mood. Lúthien sprang into the air, and her voice came dropping down like rain into pools, profound and dark. She cast her cloak before his eyes and set upon him a dream dark as the outer void where once he walked alone. Suddenly he fell as a hill sliding in avalanche, and hurled like thunder from his throne, lay prone upon the floors of hell. The iron crown rolled echoing from his head. All things were still. So that's it. Lúthien 1, Morgoth 0. But now it is Beren's turn for a little bit of heroism. So, after Lúthien puts Morgoth to sleep, she lays a hand on Beren and casts aside his werewolf disguise. And then Beren draws his dagger, Angreast. Now, I briefly mentioned Angrist in the last video, as this was the blade of Curufin, the son of Feanor, who tried to kidnap Lúthien and then got almost throttled to death by Beren. And after being instructed not to kill Curufin, Beren took his dagger from him, and it is with this dagger that Beren is going to try and cut a Silmaril from Morgoth's Iron Crown. However, what I did not mention in the last video is that despite being owned by an elven prince, Angrist is not an elvish weapon. It was actually forged by a dwarf of Nogrod called Telchar. The same Telchar who forged the sword Narsil, by the way. And there are two reasons that I bring this up. Firstly, I think it's another subtle example of one of Tolkien's most major themes. If a Silmaril is going to be reclaimed, it will be done so by a man with the help of an elf and the weapon of a dwarf. Once again, when it comes to the biggest moments in Middle-earth's history, we see that it is different people from different races coming together to achieve something that no one race could do on their own. Anyway, the second reason that I bring this up is for the sake of a little bit of foreshadowing. You see, this is very much not the only time that dwarves, specifically from Nogrod, are going to involve themselves in the doom of this very Silmaril. I don't want to spoil anything in advance, but before the end of the First Age, the dwarves of Nogrod are going to come back in a really big way, and it will be intimately bound to the Silmaril. But anyway, back in this moment, Beren becomes the first and only person ever to take a Silmaril from Morgoth. Well, at least the only incarnate person. With Angrist, he cuts a jewel from the iron claws that hold it in place, and the Silmaril falls into his hand. Which is where we see another incredibly cool detail, because if you've seen my earlier playlist about Feanor and his crafting of the Silmarils, then you'll probably remember that after the jewels were first made, they were hallowed by Varda, and a spell of protection was placed upon them. It was decreed that thereafter no mortal flesh might touch them without being scorched and withered. And yet, when the Silmaril lands in Beren's mortal hand, the jewel suffered his touch and hurt him not. And again, I don't think this is a part of Varda's magic. I think this actually goes way beyond her. She made it so that no mortal nor any unclean hand could ever touch a Silmaril without being burned, and so that's why they burned Morgoth when he first stole them. But it is Ilúvatar himself who needs Beren to take one. And so just as Beren was able to pass through the girdle of melyn with Ilúvatar's intervention, I believe that he is immune to the hallowing of Varda, because Varda's creator, Ilúvatar, is the one protecting him. However, as triumphant as this moment may seem, it is not the end of the story. You see, as Beren closed his fist around the Silmaril and his hand became as a shining lamp, it entered Beren's mind that he does not need to stop at just one Silmaril. He has all three in his grasp right here. And I'm not really sure what it is that motivates this idea. I suppose on the one hand it might just be greed, but Beren doesn't strike me as a greedy character. Maybe he just believes that Lúthien's love is worth more than a single Silmaril, and if he can deliver all three to her father, then his right to marry her will never again be questioned. But this is not the fate of the Silmarils. It is not Beren's destiny to reclaim all three. It is his destiny to separate them, to take one and remove it from Morgoth's influence. And so, as Beren goes to cut the second Silmaril from Morgoth's crown, the blade of Angrist breaks in his hand, and a shard goes flying straight into Morgoth's cheek. Morgoth stirs and groans, and all of Angband begins to wake up. And so, Beren and Lúthien run for their lives. They don't bother with disguises anymore, they just flee, heedless, up the stairs towards the light of day. But, of all the beings in Angband, the first one to awake is the first one that was put to sleep, Kacharoth. He stands at the gate and bars the escape of Beren and Lúthien, and unlike last time, Lúthien is now spent. She used so much of her power in putting Morgoth to sleep that she is now unable to quell the wolf. And so everything comes down to Beren. He squares up to Kacharoth and he shouts, "Get you gone and fly, for here is a fire that shall consume you and all evil things." And Beren thrust the Silmaril before the eyes of the wolf. However, Tolkien tells us that Kacharoth was inhabited by a devouring spirit that awoke within him to sudden fire. In fact, of Kacharoth's many names, one that Tolkien gives us in The Shaping of Middle-earth is Boroscythe, which means the ever-hungry. And so, Kacharoth's jaws clamp down on Beren's wrist, and he bites off Beren's hand, the hand that was holding the Silmaril. And in the very poetic Lay of Lúthien, we are given an extended description of this moment that makes it all the more harrowing. As gleam of swords in fire there flashed the fangs of Kacharoth and crashed together like a trap that tore the hand about the wrist and shore through brittle bone and sinew mesh, devouring the frail mortal flesh, and in that cruel mouth unclean engulfed the jewel's holy sheen. And that is the final line of the entire Lay of Lúthien. It ends on such an enormous cliffhanger. But luckily, the story is continued in the Silmarillion, although things are going to get a lot worse before they get better. Because not only is Beren now severely wounded and one-handed right before the gate of Angband, but he's lost the Silmaril. We are told that there was venom on the fangs of the wolf, and so agony and blood loss aren't even Beren's biggest problems right now. However, as terrible as things might be going for Beren, they are actually going considerably worse for Kacharoth. Because although Beren was immune to the burning effects of the Silmarils, the wolf is not. Swiftly, all his innards were filled with a flame of anguish, and the Silmaril seared his accursed flesh. In an instant, Kacharoth fled before Beren and Lúthien, howling so loudly that the gate of Angband echoed with the clamour of his torment. He fled from Angband and disappeared from sight. Tolkien wrote that so terrible did he become in his madness that all the creatures of Morgoth upon any of the roads that led thither fled far away. For he slew all living things that stood in his path and burst from the north with ruin upon the world. Of all the terrors that came ever into Beleriand ere Angband's fall, the madness of Kacharoth was the most dreadful, for the power of the Silmaril was hidden within him. And so Kacharoth and his madness of agony are something that I'm going to focus on a huge amount in the next video. But right now, I want to explain how Beren and Lúthien survive this insanely desperate situation that they've landed in. Because even Tolkien tells us that thus the quest of the Silmaril was like to have ended in ruin and despair. At this moment, Beren is presumably bleeding profusely from his stump, slowly succumbing to the venom of Kacharoth's fangs, and behind him, in the depths of Angband, a great wrath is aroused. The hosts of Morgoth have awakened, and the only thing between Beren and instant death is Lúthien, but she has used too much of her strength already. She is able to put forth her failing power just enough to withdraw the venom from Beren's wound, but she cannot fight off Morgoth and his Balrogs and the swarms of orcs that are now hurrying towards her. It really does look like it's game over. But in this moment we see another great theme of Tolkien's come to the forefront, and that theme is eucatastrophe. Now, I don't actually know if eucatastrophe is a word that I've used at all before on this channel, but I probably should have because it's a big deal. It's a legitimate literary term, it has its own Wikipedia page, but it was also a term that was invented by Tolkien. Eu, of course, means good in Greek, and in this context, catastrophe just means the conclusion of the drama. And this idea of eucatastrophe is something that Tolkien went into a lot of detail on in his essay on fairy stories, which is an excellent read if you want to learn more about the root of Tolkien's ideas concerning a fictional secondary world. Anyway, the basic premise of eucatastrophe is that when all seems darkest and all hope is lost, evil will somehow fail, and out of the seemingly impossible, goodness will overcome. Eucatastrophe is basically a very fancy word for a happy ending, but it is much more profound than just your average happy ending. A eucatastrophe can really only exist in a story where there is some sort of benevolent higher power who is guiding the wheels of the world. Perhaps the absolute clearest example of a eucatastrophe in Tolkien's Legendarium comes at the end of Return of the King. You know, when Frodo fails at the final moment and he claims the ring for himself, Sauron's victory is almost certainly assured, but then at the very last minute, Gollum appears to bite the ring from Frodo's finger, and as he gloats on the edge of the cracks of doom, he falls and the ring is destroyed. It is the risky pity of Bilbo and Frodo, and the treacherous nature of Sauron's ring and the plan of Ilúvatar that ultimately fuels this eucatastrophe. And I guess it is easy to think of eucatastrophe as just kind of being a type of deus ex machina, but I think this is a bit of a reductive argument. Typically, a deus ex machina appears in a story due to, lazy writing. I think it's a symptom of contrivance. And look, I don't want to be roasted in the comments by Harry Potter fans, but I will just say as an example, in the Chamber of Secrets, when Fawkes the Phoenix just happens to show up at the right moment with just the right weapon, and then he just happens to heal Harry with his tears, and then he just happens to fly them all out of danger at the end, is a little bit of a plot convenience. It's a little bit of a deus ex machina. And I would argue, in my opinion, it strikes me as kind of artificial. But artificial is not a word that can be applied to Tolkien's secondary world, to his sub-creation. The central theme of eucatastrophe is that there is a higher power in this story who created the universe and will not let evil triumph. Not in the end. Anyway, back to Beren and Lúthien and their catastrophe. In this very moment of their ruin and despair, above the walls of the valley, 3 mighty birds appeared with wings swifter than the wind. And of course, the prime agents of Tolkien's eucatastrophes are almost always the eagles. In all 3 of his main books, the Silmarillion, the Hobbit, and the Lord of the Rings, there is a moment where our protagonists are in grievous peril, but then the eagles show up to the rescue. And in the Silmarillion, that moment comes now. So, the chief of these 3 mighty eagles is Thorondor, the lord of all eagles and a faithful servant of King Manwë's. And we've seen Thorondor a few times before. He was the one who flew Maedhros and Finnegan to safety after Maedhros' imprisonment on Thangorodrim, and it was also Thorondor who messed up Morgoth's face and rescued Finnegan's body during the Dagor Bragolach. But what's immensely cool is that if we look at the Grey Annals, which are published in the War of the Jewels, we are told that the other 2 eagles in this scene are also a really big deal in Middle-earth. They are Landraval and his brother Gwaihir, the Wind Lord. And of course, both Landraval and Gwaihir will show up again in about 6,500 years to rescue another couple from the realm of a Dark Lord after the completion of their quest. But this is actually Gwaihir's first chronological appearance in all of Tolkien's writings. Anyway, just before Beren and Lúthien are devoured by the powers of Angband, Thorondor, Landraval, and Gwaihir swoop down and bear them away from the realm of Morgoth. And we are actually told that the reason these eagles were in this part of the world at this time is due to the actions of Huan. He had sent messengers to all the birds and beasts that aren't in the service of the Dark Lord, and he told them the need of Beren. So, the eagles fly Lúthien and Beren a long way from Angband. They flew over Anfauglith, over Tower Nufuin, and even over the hidden valley of Tumladen. And there, Lúthien looks down, and far below she sees what looks like a white light starting from a green jewel. And this white radiance within the valley of Tumladen is, of course, the secret city of Gondolin. Beren and Lúthien never actually venture there, but Lúthien does at least witness Gondolin the Fair from the skies. Anyway, the eagles drop Beren and Lúthien off at the borders of Doriath, but although they're both alive, they are not looking good. We are told that Lúthien wept, for she thought that Beren would surely die. He spoke no word nor opened his eyes, and knew thereafter nothing of his flight. And so, that is where I will end this video, because although it may seem like the climax of the story, it is certainly not yet the end. Beren still has a quest to fulfill, and there's still an insane werewolf rampaging through Beleriand with a Silmaril searing his insides. So, we'll return to Kacharoth and to Doriath and to Eleuthingol in the next video as we enter the final act of the great tale of Beren and Lúthien. So, to make sure you don't miss that, hit subscribe if you haven't already, and don't forget to hit like and leave a comment on this video if you want to. Anyway, as always, until next time, my dear friends, much love, stay groovy, and navaer melyn.